Okay, take a look here. WCW at Toronto, Ontario, Skydome, April 28th, 1993. It was a matinee. There was 3,850 paid people in the building. And there were probably a few other thousand that got in for free. Featured an interview with Ric Flair. Tuchel Scorpio Marcus Bagwell defeated Tex Lazenzer, Shanghai Pierce. Max Payne defeated Steve Regal. Johnny B. Bad defeated Chris Benoit. Van Hammer beat Vinny of Vegas. Rick Steamboat defeated Brian Pillman. NWA World Champ Barry Windham beat Ron Simmons. U.S. Champion Dustin Rhodes and Cactus Jack defeated Rick Rude. And Paul Orndorff, the TV champion. WCW World Champ Big Van Vader defeated... Sting defeated Big Van Vader by DQ. I'm going to zoom out. Put the camera on old me, who's been a wrestling fan for a long time, and this is a holy grail show. WCW in the 90s did not come to Canada very often. At least not until Eric Bischoff got involved and turned WCW into what it was, the NWO and all that good stuff. The last time WCW had come into Toronto, I believe, was 1990. I did not go to that. They ran a small show that drew about 400 fans in a small arena with 7 mid-card matches. Skydome. When did they open that Skydome? 1989, 90, whatever. Anyway, there was, I guess, an issue with venues. The Sky Tent. Most of you know the Skydome is the baseball stadium of the Toronto Blue Jays. It holds approximately 50,000 for baseball. It has hosted 2 WrestleManias, in which the attendance has been reportedly over 67,000. The Sky Tent is a big, literally a piece of canvas that blocks off a portion of the stadium to make it look like it's actually a small, quasi-theater-sized venue. So, it was basically a 6,000 seat venue, if you could imagine something like that. And the big news at this time was Ric Flair had just finished his infamous WWF run, where he had quit JCP, Jim Crockett Promotions, and left with the NWA belt, came up to New York and proclaimed himself the real world champion. Ultimately found himself in an amazing feud with Roddy Piper that sold out house shows all over the North America and probably the world. We got a tremendous match with Randy Savage at WrestleMania 8. We got 1992 Royal Rumble with Ric Flair, probably the best Royal Rumble ever. And we got a few Flair Hogan house shows, matches that I guess weren't good enough for them to push that into a pay-per-view. That wouldn't happen till 94. And then Flair was unhappy and wanted out, so Vince McMahon said, put over Kurt Hennig. So Rick and Hennig did the house show loop for a while, and eventually there was a retirement match on the new TV show called Monday Night Raw. And Hennig sent Flair on his way. So Flair had a no-compete clause at the end of his contract for, I believe, 6 months. So he wasn't able to wrestle. However, he could show up on other wrestling shows and do interviews. So here we are, 3,850 paid fans jam into this funny-looking Sky Tent, and the ring announcer immediately says, we're bringing out Ric Flair for an interview. And leading up to this show, Ric Flair had been on the radio in Toronto, local radio station, promoting the show, taking calls from people. I actually called into that radio station to speak with Flair, but at the time, Flair had gone to the bathroom, so I didn't even get to say hello, but that's okay. So Flair comes out, takes a big bow, says it's great to be here, great to be back in WCW, and looking forward to the night show. You're going to see one hell of a show. You're seeing some of the best athletes in the sport. On and on and on. Took his bow and off he went. Too Cold Scorpio Marcus Alexander Bagwell. A young, I don't know what you call them, high flyer team at the time. A far cry from what Buff Bagwell would eventually come. This is a babyface, big time. Tex Slazenger, Shanghai Pierce would eventually go on to fame in the WWF as the Godwin brothers, Henry and Phineas, and it's way too many other gimmicks to count. But from what I recall, this was a really good tag match, back and forth. Great way to open the show. I was seated probably 6 or 7 rows up in the stands, and that's beyond the ringside seats. It seemed pretty close, so I had a pretty good view of this show. Then it was Max Payne against Steve Regal. This is not the original Steve Regal from way back when, but the William Regal that we would know in WWE. Payne, they were both bad guys. Max Payne would eventually become Man Mountain Rock in the WWF, and that flopped, but Payne was this like 390-pound psychological maniac, like a dark character, almost not too far off from Mankind. I don't remember why the two of them had a match, to be honest. Johnny B. Bad came out. Bad actually had a feud with Payne, and at one point, Johnny B. Bad, who would go on to become Mark Marrow, of course, had a famous Bad Blaster in which he would shoot confetti into the air and into the crowd. And of course, one day Payne took that thing and nailed him in the eye with it. Johnny B. Bad beat Chris Benoit. Doesn't say if it was pin or whatever. I'm pretty sure. Yet everything was pin or submission except otherwise mentioned. So yeah, that's a big win. Johnny B. Bad pinning a Chris Benoit, who had a short stint in WCW. I think he left and came back a couple times. My God, look at this next one. Van Hammer. Everyone will remember him. Big, tall, 6'7", 6'8", muscle man, long blonde hair. Kind of reminds you of, I guess, Kevin Nash of the New World Order. Guess who he wrestled? Kevin Nash. But that was back when Nash had this horrible Vinny Vegas gimmick, where he came out to the ring as if he was a gambler, and they weren't taking him seriously yet, and Hammer beat him. Supposed to be a tag team title match next. This is right around the time where the WCW and the NWA were trying to decide whether or not they wanted to work together. We had separate world titles in the singles division, but we had a unified tag team. Shane Douglas was teaming up with Ricky Steamboat. They were the tag team champions. Or no, they were at one point. Ricky Steamboat, yeah. Douglas had issues. He couldn't get across the border into Canada, so we're stuck with Ricky Steamboat. It would have been a hell of a tag match. The Hollywood Blondes, Brian Pillman and Steve Austin. Steve Austin, I believe, was there in the corner of Brian Pillman, who wrestled Ricky Steamboat in a singles match. So here you have a guy who would go on to be perhaps the biggest star in the history of the 90s and perhaps the history of the era, Steve Austin. And he's standing in somebody's corner for a match. Granted, it was really good. The Pillman Steamboat singles match was a very good one. And that tag team feud went on and on and on, and they had some tremendous matches on pay-per-view. There was a cage match. One of the best tag team feuds of any year in the 90s, if you ask me. I remember going home as a joke and telling everybody that Ricky Steamboat needed a last-minute tag partner for the match, and I stepped on the apron, but no. I actually got a few people to believe me, but no. That did not happen. NWA champion Barry Windham. Now remember, this was not the WCW champion. Barry Windham had beaten the NWA champion. Was it Muta? The NWA in 91, they stripped Flair of that title. And at the same time, WCW created a new title and had a tournament, well actually a two-man tournament, the Great American Bash 91, which resulted in Luger winning the title. But the NWA had another separate tournament. That ended up being over in Japan for a while. And the NWA belt was around the waist of 2 or 3 Japanese wrestlers. I believe, was it Riki Choshu or no, Masa Chono. Chono and Muta actually, then they kind of reconciled and brought them back to the US for a match. Bottom line, Barry Windham finally got his hands on this belt. I believe Ric Flair came out to try to congratulate Windham when he won the belt, and he kind of shoved Flair off, essentially keeping Windham heel and demonstrating that Flair was face. Windham would go on to beat Ron Simmons. Simmons is not far removed from his major upset victory over Vader for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, which is considered the real prize at that time. Of course, Sting beat Ric Flair and lost back to Flair in 91. Flair left. Luger wins the belt over Windham in a cage. Luger turns heel, picks Harley Race up as his manager. How long did Luger have that belt? Till 92, Sting got it. Then it went Sting to Vader. Then Ron Simmons somehow got it. I don't know if it was a name out of a hat or whatever. Of course, everyone can Google it, but it was surprise and unexpected. This mid-carder, Rod Simmons, beats Vader, wins the world title, first black American to win the world title. Vader would get that belt back, and he traded it back and forth with Sting several times. So, 2 world titles that are both quite meaningful. Eventually, the NWA would completely remove itself from WCW, and they would create a belt called the International title. Ravishing Rick Rude and Ric Flair would feud over that. And eventually Sting and Flair would unify that title in 94. Dustin Rhodes, the Natural. He was 2 or 3 years into his career. It's not the young rookie Dustin that we remember with Ted DiBiase getting slapping him around. Cactus Jack is a good guy. Rude and Orndorff, who were bitter enemies in WWF a few years back, are now teaming up. So Dustin and Cactus are the faces. Rude and Orndorff are the heels. One thing I'll never forget was at some point Rude was in the ring and Cactus was down, and Rude must have saved up a week's worth of snot because he just blew his nose, and it was unbelievable the amount of snot that came right out of it and landed right on Cactus's back. I think that was the biggest groan from the crowd in the whole show. One thing I remember the most from that show, quite frankly, I don't even remember what the storylines or the feuds were back then. Sting and Vader had been feuding back and forth, trading the world title back and forth. And they'd had all sorts of bizarre matches, White Castle of Fear and King of Cable. So Sting, I don't know, we all know Sting's story. He came into the first Clash in 88 as kind of an unknown and gave Flair one hell of a 45-minute time limit draw. Sting would evolve and join Flair, get kicked out of the Horsemen. They had their matches in 1990 and 91. But yeah, they were kind of struggling, I guess, to figure, okay, is Sting going to be the guy, or is it this Vader guy? Ron Simmons. Business was slow, I think. The WWF was, I guess, in a slow period. This was a slow time for wrestling. 92, 93, 94 was a real lull. after WrestleMania 9 and Hogan stole the belt from Bret Hart after the Yokozuna fiasco, it all just sort of sucked for a while. So, but eventually, as we would know, Flair would turn face and take the belt from Vader and move us on into '94. Hogan would sign with WCW, and away we went. But this little obscure show was really good, and Toronto was Flair country. Before Vince McMahon came along and kicked NWA out of Maple Leaf Gardens in '85, I think it was, NWA and Ric Flair were in Toronto once a month, so everybody loved to see Flair. I don't think anyone cared about even the matches. People went to see Ric Flair give a speech. One hell of a memory. It would be 6 years until WCW would come back to Toronto. And my goodness, how things have changed then, from 93 to 99. Of course, 99, they came in March and had Nitro. Bret Hart and Goldberg had a segment where Goldberg speared Bret, but Bret was wearing a metal plate, so they were both unconscious. Flair was a heel general manager with the belt, but he forced Hogan to wrestle Dallas Page in that main event. So yet another Flair visit to Toronto in which he did not actually wrestle in a match, and I was really pissed off because I was hoping for a match there. Of course, 7, 8, 9, 10 months later, they were back. WCW pay-per-view mayhem in Toronto. I call it the horrible Vince era, Vince Russo era, because that card just sucked. Terrible matches, all ended with interference, silly storylines, on and on and on. At least we got a Bret Hart Chris Benoit match, though, to end WCW's Toronto run. But yeah, 1993, a little known show in Toronto, WCW. If there's anybody out there, any of those 3,850 people, if you're still alive 26 years later and you see me talking about it, if you have any pictures, if you have any video footage, if you have a program, if you have a ticket stub, anything, please copy it, scan it, whatever. I'd love to see it, because that was just one hell of a wrestling show. For everyone else, I hope you enjoyed the story.